Hey, good morning, everybody. David McGlennon here. I am here with my new friend, Teresa Quinlan. And we had a conversation on LinkedIn that we were just dialoguing about a topic. And I reached out to Teresa and said, hey, would you like to just like record a session and just talk about this? Because I think that the whole topic of emotional intelligence and how emotional intelligence impacts leadership and a leader and curiosity was a topic that I thought I was fascinated with. And I thought, well, let's just dive into this a little bit. And so I invited Teresa to join me to have this conversation. So welcome, Teresa.
Thank you so much. We're hair twins.
Yes, we are. Absolutely. I love it. I love it. Well, hey, tell me a little bit about what is emotional intelligence? Like, how would you describe emotional intelligence? Just for somebody that maybe we've heard the word or we've heard the phrase, but we really don't know what that is.
And it's a good question because it can be quite a lengthy sort of definition or description. But if we package it in a nutshell, it's knowing how to use your emotional information in a really effective way. That's what it is.
Very good. Okay. Knowing
Because
how to use your emotional information in an effective way. Okay. Got
yeah,
it.
yeah. I think
Awesome.
one of the barriers sometimes is people think it's just talking about your feelings.
Right.
And that's off-putting for people. Emotional
Hmm.
intelligence, now we're just going to sit in a circle and sing kumbaya. Mm-mm.
Yeah. No, no.
It's not like that at all, right? I mean, for
Right.
some people, it certainly can be. I want to sit down, I want to hold hands, I want to be able to connect physically and intimately with you in that way. And that certainly is a branch of emotional intelligence. However, for most people, it's a process of getting to know myself and my emotional state. What does it mean? And now, how do I use those emotions in interactions to express
Mm,
myself? How do I use them to understand other people? And then, how do we use it to connect, to solve problems, make decisions, collaborate as a team? Like, you just kind of make the checklist of all the things we could potentially do together when we're both using and understanding our emotional intelligence in a really impactful and effective way together. Because when we're on opposite sides of the fence, nobody gets anything done.
yeah, no, I love that, and I love the way you describe that because one of the things that I think that um, I've come to recognize is that if I pay attention to my emotional state, or if I understand, let's say, what's triggering me, or those emotions in a given situation, and if I can use them appropriately, or at least even just become aware of them and go, huh, wow, I'm getting triggered here. I wonder what that's about. That in and of itself, well, I guess what I'm hearing is some emotional intelligence of being able to be aware of those emotions.
Yeah, it's that phrase of check yourself before you wreck yourself.
You're right,
Because
right.
sometimes we can see the train wreck happening and we're so emotionally engaged, or emotionally hijacked is a better term for it,
Yeah.
that we can't even stop the locomotive from the direction it's going in. We could see that we're about to crash and burn and we can't even stop ourselves. And emotional intelligence is recognizing it about 10 steps before that moment happens, right?
I love it.
And
Yeah.
the more emotionally intelligent you are, usually the sooner you recognize those things. So when you say, understanding your own triggers or identifying your own triggers, a lot of the times the first step is noticing them in the moment they're happening, and then improving your emotional intelligence is knowing them way before you go into the interaction. Like, I know these type of people, these types of situations trigger me emotionally. When I go into meetings where we're going to be arguing our points, I have to watch out for the fact that I like to be right. And so going into those moments, I have to do things like have water, have tea. Tea is soothing for me, so it helps me to temper my emotional state. I have to have a pen and notes and constantly think about what are they saying that I want to ask a question about. So I really have to work on, I know I'm going to be triggered. That's my natural tendency. And I have all of these strategies lined up to keep my emotions in check so I can continue to think logically and really salvage the relationship. Because if I get on the locomotive, I'm going to ruin the relationship pretty fast.
Yeah. No.
Mhm.
I, you said something too that talk to me about a little bit more about like being able to ask questions, because I think that's where we started. One of the things that I like to do is I like to ask questions, and I'm curious about things. But I also know that there are times when if I have a strongly held position,
Mhm.
that I can get away from asking questions and being curious, because I want to be able to react, as opposed to asking, like, tell me more about that. How did you come to that conclusion? And being curious. So I think, I guess my question is, how does emotional intelligence, or being emotionally intelligent, help me as a leader to really be able to ask those questions and stay curious instead of being triggered, or letting myself be hijacked?
Mhm. It's a really good question because I think we can get caught between believing we need to um, be able to change our position, as opposed to I have a firm position and a firm belief. Does emotional intelligence mean I have to give that up? And it doesn't. It means I have to know how to use my emotional state, and I have to know how to use really good language to communicate my emotional state. And then I have to ask really good questions to understand the other person's perspective. I may never agree with their perspective. I may never change my belief system or my ideas, and they don't have to believe mine either. But we have to enter into this space where we understand each other's perspective, because we need to use that information to then turn ourselves to whatever the target condition is that we're trying to influence, because we're both playing on the same team. We're both trying
Right.
to get to a similar result, whether we use your idea or my idea or something that is a combination of both of our ideas. What does that really matter? But oftentimes we get lost in the process of, are you listening to me? Like, do you hear what I'm saying? And the other person is like, do you hear what I'm saying? And all of a sudden, all we're doing is arguing with each other,
Yeah.
and we're arguing with each other's emotional experience. We're not even
Right.
arguing facts anymore, right? Because most of the time we can find that the venom behind our tone is
Hmm.
indicative of our frustration, our anger. It's indicative of our emotional experience, not my beliefs anymore or my
Right.
thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just my
So
emotional state. Yeah.
it is. It's just my emotional state, right? And so, how do you stay curious in those moments? It's the practice of watching yourself like a hawk. So if I know I'm going into an interaction and I explain my side and the other person doesn't do any acknowledgement, they just go into explaining their side, then the first thing I might notice is, oh, I feel that little lump in my throat that I get when I start to get irritated.
Right.
And so I notice, right? And I might not be listening to them for a minute because I'm noticing this. And then I'm deploying a strategy that helps me to decrease this level of frustration, so it doesn't go from frustrated to irritated to whatever the escalation points are. So I might take a few deep breaths and I might do a mantra internally, and probably watching my internal dialogue of, oh, look at them, they're trying to prove me wrong, they're not even listening to me, now I'm not worthy of being listened to, and on the tape goes.
Right.
So that first inclination, the very subtle physical cues, is generally what we have to have a heightened awareness of in those moments, so that we can immediately deploy a strategy that squashes it from escalating, and that allows us to return to thinking, return to active listening, return to, oh, what you just said, I don't really understand that, so let me now ask a question.
Right. Right. It's interesting, because as you explain that, it reminds me of something that I had a conversation with Claude Silver, a couple of months ago, and she talks about holding space, and she talks about holding space for someone, by just being there and listening, and that active listening. And in a lot of ways, what you're describing is that holding space, because it's checking my own ego, checking my own emotions, but being engaged in an understanding, and being able to, as you described it, kind of being in my paraphrase here, being in the arena together, but yet we're on the same team, as opposed to being like opponents. And so that's some of what I'm hearing you say. How do you get to that place where you begin to become more
Mhm.
emotionally intelligent? how do you do that? So, if you've got let's say I'm working with a leader who
Mhm.
is not very emotionally intelligent, doesn't know her or his emotional state, and is really unaware. How do you bring that awareness?
Sometimes it can be really challenging, because if you're noticing it from the outside and they're not noticing it from the inside, to convince them is going to be difficult. So when people are ready for it, then an assessment, the EQI 2.0 assessment is a great assessment basis because people like data.
Yeah.
People like data to prove what they're good at and to also prove or confirm what areas of opportunity,
Hmm.
perhaps.
Right, right.
And it depends on sort of maybe whose model of emotional intelligence that you look at as well, or whose description you want to look at, because there are some significant differences between how each researcher or author of different books presents emotional intelligence. So if you're looking, like Travis Bradberry brings the four quadrants, a personal competence and a social competence, and he recommends you always start with the self-awareness part of the personal competence, because if you can improve your self-awareness, the other three areas of his model automatically improve. And if we even take something as simple as that description and look at, well, if I do get better at my own awareness and I'm capable of then managing those emotions, which is the second step, then all of a sudden the interaction is going to be better.
Mm-hmm,
Our
mm-hmm.
abilities in that interaction are going to be better. So if I'm trying to help someone understand that their emotions might be getting in their way, great coaches help people to come to that understanding on their own just by asking some questions. Like, have you ever noticed when you're in a conversation with someone that you interrupt a lot or that you talk over people? Have you ever noticed that you don't ask a lot of questions? And bit by bit through those question asking, people might come to that realization on their own. Then there's also sort of this underlying belief. I believe that people are not unaware. I believe people are aware and they often just choose to ignore,
Oh,
use
interesting.
avoidance. Sometimes it can just be a little easier. Or they do the famous, well, that's just what I'm like. Like
Right,
that's just me,
right.
that's just my personality. I can't do anything about it. Right. And you're just like,
Yeah,
well, you can. You just have
yeah.
to want something about it, and sort of helping them to see through the discomfort that will come with growth by asking them to explore what I think is a really powerful question of what are people missing out on by you not growing in this area, and what are you missing out on by refraining yourself from growing in this area. Because it'll be twofold. You'll certainly notice as an individual there are things that are going to be lacking, and you probably see them, and you want the better way, you want that better path, you want the better relationships, you want the better problem solving, you want the better salary, you want all the better things, and you're just holding yourself back for a number of reasons. Could be fear of failure, which is usually the number one reason why people don't want to do things.
Yeah.
It's not that they can't, right? They just
Right,
don't want. Hmm. Yeah.
right, right. Yeah.
So your question, how do you get people to sort of that self-awareness area is the biggest area of opportunity for most people to start their journey. And sometimes before self-awareness is even looking at the stressors impacting the individual's life that might be
Mhm.
preventing them from being so self-aware. So when we look at we could look at anybody's to-do list and probably from the outside go, "Oof, that's a lot of stuff you got on your, like, how are you going to get all of that done today? I just don't know."
Yeah.
And they look at their own list and go, "That's my list every single day."
Mm.
And so you might start with stress management strategies so that their anxiety level becomes low enough that they can start to pay attention to themselves. Because if I'm always in a heightened state of stress, my amygdala is always firing in reactive mode. I cannot think logically, which means I can't really be looking internally at myself.
Interesting. Yeah, that's
Mm.
interesting. Yeah, I know that one of my connections and friends here on LinkedIn, um, Anton, and I can never pronounce his last name, but it's a big long last name. He talks about stress and how we have to be able to reduce stress so that we can, be able to manage things better. So I think that's a big point that you're making. And something else that you said just a moment ago, I think is really a big point that I like to talk about in my even coaching client arrangements, because you talked about the personality and somebody saying, well, that's just the way I am. There's a real danger in personality assessments, whether you're using whatever assessment you use, DISC or Myers-Briggs or predictive index, whatever. There's a danger in boxing yourself in to be able to say, that's just the way I am. And I think that that's such a powerful statement. Well, I am this way. If you say you're this way, then you're going to be that way. That's your model of the world. However, if I know that that's my tendency, I can also overcome that by going outside the box and being able to be uncomfortable for a little bit. And maybe it's time for me to begin to talk off the cuff, or maybe it's time for me to back off. If my personality is a little bit stronger, maybe I need to be more reserved and listen. So whatever that is, don't be boxed in by those personality assessments. Would you agree or disagree?
I 100% agree with that. And the word you use that I think helps to tip the scales for people is it's your tendencies. It's not in stone, cannot change them, so on and so they cannot be influenced. These are my natural tendencies are towards this. It's the same when you do your first emotional intelligence assessment. You'll notice your assessment outlines your natural tendencies. So for example, in mine, I'm quite high in the decision-making and independence scales, which means when I make decisions or solve problems, I prefer to do them on my own. And independence means I'm generally free from the emotional states of other people in my decision-making process. Now, as a leader, that's not a great way to go about making decisions, because there's other people you need to consider in the decision-making process. So because that's my tendency, when I go into decision-making that's impacting a team that I'm leading, I have to dial up my empathy, which is another skill in emotional intelligence. And I am an empath, but I don't often think empathetically in decision-making. I think very logically in decision-making processes. So when someone's emotional, being an empath means that I can get right in the emotion with them and I feel it with them. When someone cries, I cry. It's like trigger responses for me. But being empathetic is very different than being an empath. And so in this relationship, it's about me remembering this is my strong tendency. And if I do not think empathetically, if I don't behave in an empathetic manner, I'm going to cut off these people that are very important to me because I'm not thinking about them in my natural tendency state. So you're completely right. I agree 100% that personality sometimes can be a blame when it really is just a tendency. And you can make up for those tendencies by balancing the scale, which generally you have to work a little harder at, right? But if you're aware of it and you have strategies and you've been practicing those strategies, they become habits that you just know, oh, in this moment, I now have to do X. And then X becomes successful to getting the result I would like to get.
Yeah, right. How do you best, what would your advice be to a team, or maybe a team leader that basically wants to increase the emotional intelligence of their team so that they can function better, they can be higher performing, they can, really have that champion mindset? What's their first step?
Sometimes it's about identifying maybe the behaviors that you need to see. So it's the same when you think about culture, right? So when you work with people and identifying their culture, you have them do, if I remember correctly from our first conversation, you have them do a process where they have to categorically describe the behaviors that indicate their culture are thriving.
Correct. Yes.
So this is what our culture looks like in action.
Right.
So for teams that want to collaborate, be dynamic, work together really well, it's the same thing. They have to start with defining what are the behaviors we need to see as a team to work well together. This is almost like every job profile you see. They need to work well with other people. They need to be able to share ideas, collaborate. Like these things are already written, but
Right.
the emotional state underneath it is what's missing.
Ah,
How do I emotionally deal with conflict? And so, what is the behaviors that are acceptable when we disagree?
oh,
So,
yeah.
it's fine for me to disagree with you, for me to even be angry with you, but it is not okay for me to yell at you, to call you names, to roll my eyes.
Right. Right.
It's okay in conflict for us to ask for time to deep breathe, do exercise. It's okay for us to say out loud the emotional experience we're having and how it's impacting our ability to be collaborative in nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay. So, those sort of definitions for teams really help for people to feel comfortable to speak up when their emotions are getting in the way of them being a contributing member of the team.
Yeah.
And then also, I think for the leader of the team to easily hold people accountable to observed behaviors. So if I set the parameter of you can be angry, but you can't call names, or you can be angry, but you're not allowed to yell at people, and you come into a team meeting and you yell at someone, my job is to call that behavior
Call it out.
immediately. Because as soon as I give an inch, they're all taking a mile.
Right.
It's just
Right.
like parenting.
Yes, exactly. We were just talking about that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is. I mean, the similarity. If you're a parent and a leader, the similarities are are. I mean, they're hand in hand. You have so many skills that you could just cross contaminate in being a manager of people and a parent.
I'm laughing because I'm thinking to myself, the times when I was talking about my triggers, the times when I get triggered the most are oftentimes with my kids. So
Mhm.
as a leader, I can, see, and I have seen that in teams, oftentimes because we work so closely together, we can get triggered. And if we don't hold ourselves accountable, and I was just talking about accountability to a group of emerging leaders that I work with, that if we're not doing that, we're actually doing our team a disservice, because
Mhm.
we're not if we say we want to be a high performing company or a high performing team, and we don't hold ourselves to that, those are agreed upon behaviors or agreed upon decisions. And if we don't have somebody calling that out, that hey, we're not living up to that, we're doing ourselves a disservice.
Yeah, I mean, a super high performing team would mean every member of that team would feel comfortable calling out the behavior that breaks the agreement.
Right.
As a peer, I should be able to call my peer out on, hey, I just noticed you did this behavior that's not allowed in the room. What's going on? It has to be followed up with that question of caring that
Right.
is recognizing you're in trouble. You're struggling with something right now. So
Hmm.
let me create the space for us to manage this and step in with you. And then you've got the support of the collective of the team. Like, how
Yeah.
awesome would that? That would just be incredible to have a team dynamic that notices one person's a little off and they pause to
Yeah.
get one person in with the rest of the team. And we don't move forward until we can all move forward.
Teresa, you just said something there that I think that triggered for me, because we had this question about, you know, I think there's a fear of holding people accountable. But I think the way you just described it, holding people accountable is noticing, number one, then holding space to be able to say what's going on,
Mhm.
and at the same time, how can I help? And just giving that person a chance to be able to assess. And I think that gets missed in accountability an awful lot, that we don't recognize that being accountable isn't necessarily about pointing a finger at something like you did this in the past, and so I'm holding you accountable.
Mm.
Being accountable is really being able to, in the moment and actually looking in the present, to be able to say, hey, what's going on? I observe this behavior. Tell me a little bit about what's going on. And then being present and listening. And I just think that's a really interesting perspective.
When you work with someone, it doesn't take long to get to know what is characteristic of them
Hmm.
and to notice the subtle changes when something's off.
Right.
And emotionally intelligent teams pick up on those subtle things very quickly. Oftentimes, a team member will pick up on it faster than the individual will because they think they're doing a good job of hiding it.
Right, right.
Right. But a team member will be like, you seem off. And I can't even put my finger on it, but you just seem a little off. Are you okay? And that opens a window for me to say, yep, I'm fine, and just swallow it. Right.
Right.
Or opens the window for me to say, yep, I'm feeling a little, and then insert the emotional experience you're having in the moment. Right.
Right.
I think
Right.
there's there sometimes can be a cultural or workplace fear that I think we're trying to get away from when we think about companies and organizations. We're trying to get away from this. We don't talk about how we feel in the workplace.
Right.
And we're trying to get into, can we just name the experience, the emotional experience I'm having right now? Can I just say it out loud? As easily as I would say, I'm really happy. We're almost permissive of things like, I'm super happy, super excited, I'm so jazzed up. We're okay with people saying that. But we're not okay with people saying, this is frustrating. I'm so angry. Why are we making another change? Man, I'm pissed off. When really the reality of those are extremes of emotional states. And any extreme is interruptive of our ability to be innovative, creative, is interruptive of our ability to hold space for people. So if I'm at the extreme end of the happy emotion scale of ecstatic, when we see people so ecstatic, they can barely get their words out. They're not being productive, right? So even that heightened emotion state is not a good one to be in if we're trying to be innovative and creative and we're trying to, but we tend to label those emotional states as good or bad. And when we label them, that's what makes them permissive to be in an environment of the workplace. But if we stop labeling them, then they all become permissive or none of them become permissive. And I guess it depends, which would you rather have?
Right, right. What would you say? So if you've got someone who says, I really don't like stepping into that emotional state or stepping into the emotions of, because I know the tendency of so and so is to be defensive or whatever. How do you help people to kind of step into that and maybe lower the fear or lower the fear level? Because I think that sometimes that accountability, at least in the discussion that I was having this week, there's a fear of holding someone accountable because of a reaction or to be disruptive of the dynamics of the team, because, hey, we don't want to, we want everybody to be, getting along here. Everybody, we want to sing Kumbaya. Let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya.
Right.
Well, how would you help that person to be able to actually go beyond that?
Well, there's a couple of things. I think the first one is remembering that you can't own anyone's emotional reactions. You're not responsible for them. You cannot control them. You can't own them. And their emotional reaction or reactions to you speaks of their character, not yours. So when you lean in to ask the question, I noticed this, are you okay? And they blow up, that it's not that you did something wrong.
Right.
Right? Remember, the reaction that they give is their character, not yours. So your intention was one that was meant to be caring and empathetic and inclusive, and you're concerned about the relationship, which means you're concerned about the team, which means concerned about the company, and just, you can build that wide lens, or you can narrow the lens, however you want to look at it.
Right.
So I think that's probably the first thing that gets in people's way is thinking that they have control over that. And they don't have control. So if you can release that control and just understand, well, if they blow up, then what's my next move? Can you prepare for that? Potentially you can prepare for, I can see perhaps you don't want to talk about this right now. And if you change your mind, I'm here for you.
Right.
And you just sort of leave it at that.
Right.
And this is sometimes when we get into things like Vital Smarts is a company that runs crucial accountability, crucial conversations. They run a bunch of training related to how do I dive into starting the conversation that's going to be difficult when I think the other person might feel unsafe and therefore react in violence or silence, right?
Yeah.
And they teach skills that are related to almost scripting.
Okay.
So if I feel like someone might blow up at me, then I'm going to go in with an explanation of my intention first, and
Okay.
then give my observation. What I
Yes.
don't want to do is this. What I do want to do is this. And then open up the dialogue. And hopefully, if I explain my intention, that will prevent the blow up from happening.
Right.
What these types of programs sometimes fail in teaching is the emotional undertone that I need to go into that, being empathetic and thinking about the relationship and being self-aware of my own emotional state. Because if I'm super nervous, if I'm really in a heightened emotional state and I'm not controlling it well, it's not the right time for me to have this conversation.
Yeah.
So I first have to be aware of, if I'm so worried about them reacting, I probably shouldn't step in.
Yes. Right.
I need to get myself under control first, and then I can step in to have the conversation, because then my emotional state will be under control.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I love that. No, I think that's really, really helpful. Gosh, I could go on for a long time in this conversation because I think this is a really good conversation. And I think that this is something that, as you know, many organizations, many companies really need to grapple with the whole. I mean, let's face it, companies are humans. You know, at this point, we're still humans that are running companies. And so that human element, because we're humans, we run on emotion. And so being able to emotionally understand and interact with other humans is a skill that is not soft, and it is not easy. It's a
Right.
hard thing to do. And at the same time, it yields both financial benefits for the company, but it also yields much more pleasant environment and a more pleasant culture to be able to attract other talent and also win business and all of the
Mhm.
things that high performing companies and world-class companies want and do. So I love what you're doing in fostering the whole conversation around
Mhm.
emotional intelligence, Teresa. It's amazing. How can people get a hold of you? So if somebody's listening to this and they say, man, I would really like to be able to assess my team or be able to have a further conversation about really getting into emotional intelligence, how do they get a hold of you?
Yeah. Oh, thanks, David. This is great. I mean, obviously connecting with me right on LinkedIn, and then that would be an easy way to message me. My website is Teresa, or my email. What? My email is Teresa at, and this is an easy one to remember, I think. It's the 3 Qs, IQ, EQ, TQ.com, right? So it's your intelligence quotient plus your emotional quotient is equal to your talent quotient. Because we've hired a whole bunch of people that are really smart. We know that they
Yep.
could do the task we need them to do. But if we're not getting that centerpiece of their emotional quotient jacked up, our talent quotient will never reach its pinnacle.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Okay, so give it again. Teresa at
IQ, EQ, TQ.com.
.com.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. This has been fun, and I've loved just being able to get to know you better and really have this conversation. Thanks for doing this. I really do appreciate it. It's amazing. I've learned a lot even just in this conversation, and I really appreciate it. And I think it's going to be a lot of value to some people who listen to it, and hopefully it'll bring a raised awareness to their own emotional intelligence.
Yes. Well, thank you, David, obviously, for the invitation. Great
Absolutely.
conversation, great questions, like really insightful questions. I can only imagine your depth of experience with companies is what allows you to really have this perspective of what do people really need to know so that they can do better.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you. That's great. But it's been fun. Thanks again. I'm going to till next time. We'll keep on being emotionally intelligent.
Yes, that's right. Till next
All
time.
right. Till next time.